Welcome to Lecture 7, the carbon cycle. So, we will begin this lecture by looking at the Earth from a systems perspective. The Earth can be separated into different spheres or systems, and we'll be talking about what composes each and the names of them. Then we will be discussing what is carbon and why do we care about it? What's the big deal concerning carbon? Turns out it's very important to understand. And then we will be looking at short-term and long-term carbon exchanges. And these are both components of the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle refers to how carbon is transferred, moves around between the different Earth spheres or systems that we will be discussing. And the carbon cycle has a different, two different speeds. Okay, there's a slower carbon cycle, which is the long-term carbon cycle, and there's the faster carbon cycle, the short-term carbon cycle. And reading for this lecture is Chapter 4, pages 85 through 89. So, here are a couple goals of this lecture. We want to understand the difference between the short-term and long-term carbon cycle. We want to understand how exactly the speeds are different. And we want to understand the main components of the long-term carbon cycle. There are 4 main components of the long-term carbon cycle, and we will be going into detail about them. So we've been talking about different forms of carbon already in the class. When we talk about the carbon cycle, it turns out we're not just talking about how carbon in one form alone moves around the different Earth spheres or systems. Okay, carbon can exist in many forms. Unlike water, for example, which always has the same chemical formula H2O. Okay, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom bonded together. Carbon can exist in many different chemical forms. We have, for example, carbon dioxide, which is made of 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. And you may remember this figure, or a very similar figure to it. This, of course, is the Keeling curve. And it shows atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations at the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Big Island of Hawaii from 1958, specifically March 1958, to about 2000. But of course, we have newer data. And as of last month, from this is being recorded in July 2016. As of June of 2016, the atmospheric CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa was nearly 407 parts per million. And this month was one of the highest, or had one of the highest carbon dioxide concentrations ever recorded at Mauna Loa. We've talked about how CO2 concentrations have now begun to exceed 400 parts per million. And we've talked about how before the early 1900s, going back 800,000 years from ice core data in the Antarctica, CO2 concentrations were never above 300 parts per million. So they're about about a third, 33% higher now, a little more than that, than they ever were going back 800,000 years before the early 20th century. And when you look at this figure, you can notice a couple things besides the obvious increase over time, the overall increase over time. You definitely notice the wobbles, right? They really stand out, these oscillations. And that's an effect of the seasons. We have talked about it briefly, and we'll be talking about it in a lot more detail in this lecture, because it turns out you can help explain the reason for the oscillations, which occur yearly. They're actually effects of the seasons. You can explain those yearly oscillations when you get into the short-term carbon cycle. So we will be talking about that, and we'll understand what months of the year carbon dioxide concentrations peak, what months they reach of the year or what month they reach a minimum, and we'll understand why that occurs. You'll also notice that in recent times, carbon dioxide concentrations have been increasing at a faster rate. So you see this figure, it's not quite, the curve isn't quite linear, okay? So the rate of increase with respect to time has increased. If you take in calculus 1, you could say there's a positive derivative, or the derivative is increasing, okay? The second derivative is positive. So, let's start talking about the Earth system perspective. Okay, so Earth is composed of 5 spheres or systems. So there's 5 systems or spheres that make up the Earth. Do you know any of them yet? We've talked about one in a lot of detail. We talked about how it's composed of gases that we breathe. It's composed of clouds that we see. It's composed of those aerosols, microscopic solid or liquid particles in the atmosphere. Oh, I just said it. I said it. The atmosphere. That's the thin layer of air that surrounds the solid Earth. Of course, it contains the air we breathe. It's where all weather occurs, and that's where the carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing. Now, there's 4 other spheres or systems. Can you think of any of them? Feel free to pause the video and try to come up with more. Second on this list is hydrosphere. And what do you think that composes? Water. So that's, and specifically, that is the sphere of liquid water as opposed to solid water. That sphere has a name for itself. So hydrosphere includes the oceans, where the overwhelming majority of liquid water is on Earth. Lakes, rivers, streams, okay, ponds even, right? So that's the hydrosphere. Then the cryosphere is composed of all solid water. So ice, and when we talk about what forms of ice make up the cryosphere, we have the biosphere. What do you think that sphere is composed of? Just look at the first 3 letters, right, of that word, bio, life, right? When you study biology, that's the science of life. So that includes humans, animals, plants, okay, microbes, and so on. All living things. Finally, we have our 5th sphere. It's the geosphere, and it's sometimes just called the solid Earth. So that sphere is the actual Earth, literally itself, okay? It's the solid Earth. It's what you see when you look at a picture of the globe. I mean, it's not the air above Earth. It's not the water on Earth. The solid liquid water on Earth. It's not all the life on Earth or in the atmosphere, right? Birds fly, and it's the hard Earth itself. So it includes the crust, which has plates that move, and rocks. It includes the mantle. It includes the core. And these machines run the Earth, okay? And it turns out material is constantly being exchanged between them. They're not cut off from each other by any means. In fact, they are very connected to each other, okay? It's very important that they are. And when we talk about the carbon cycle, we talk about how carbon in different forms is exchanged between these 5 spheres at different speeds. And when looking at these spheres and understanding them, it allows for a holistic or complete view of the planet. Because basically all of Earth, whatever part of Earth it is, you can be separated into one of these spheres. So now let's look at a figure showing some of the elements of the spheres and also how the spheres interact with each other. So this is a really powerful figure. I like this figure a lot because it teaches you a good amount of information. Here we have changes in solar inputs. That's one of the first things that stands out on the figure. So that could be sunspot, increasing or decreasing, right? Changes in the atmosphere, composition, circulation. When we know how atmosphere has been changing composition, carbon dioxide concentrations have been going up. CO2, along with methane, CH4, another form of carbon, right? Nitrous oxide, N2O. We do know that the atmosphere is mainly composed of diatomic nitrogen, diatomic oxygen, and argon. But these trace gases, trace greenhouse gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and etc., are very important because they help determine how strong the greenhouse effect is. And they are, unlike nitrogen and oxygen and argon, they are able to interact with long-wave radiation well. They're able to absorb and emit in different wavelengths of the infrared radiation spectrum. And the atmosphere is not just made up of gases, it's also made up of aerosols, which unlike gases are literally solid or liquid particles. So, we have clouds in the atmosphere as well, which can bring rain, snow, hail, sleet, freezing rain to the surface. Volcanoes can emit aerosols into the atmosphere, as was the case with Mount Pinatubo erupting in 91. It emitted a lot of dust, smoke into the atmosphere, and that reflected sunlight and caused a global temperature decrease of 0.2 Celsius the following year. And now let's look at more detail about how the spheres interact with each other. Here's an example. Biosphere is the sphere of life, so that includes trees. Okay. By the way, some of the redwood trees in far northern California are hundreds of years old, right? Even could be a few thousand years old. Well, the trees, part of the biosphere, interact with the atmosphere. Okay, so for example, during photosynthesis, trees and other forms of vegetation absorb carbon dioxide, take it in to help make carbohydrate for their nourishment, and then when they decay, certain vegetation decays. Maybe not so much trees, but they also undergo respiration, but sometimes you see more decaying of plants than trees that emits carbon dioxide back from the biosphere and the plants or trees to the atmosphere. There's soil biosphere interaction. Water from inside the Earth, the solid Earth or geosphere, can be taken in by the biosphere, the plants or trees. Land surface is part of the geosphere, basically. And it interacts with the atmosphere. Okay? Water in the geosphere, underground, groundwater, can move up and then evaporate in the atmosphere, become water vapor. So that's a way of exchanging water from the geosphere to the atmosphere. By the way, when we talk about carbon, one way to get carbon from underground, or you'll see actually most of the carbon on Earth is underground. We'll talk about where exactly. One way to get it from underground into the atmosphere is through volcanic eruptions. Going over to this side of the figure, we have hydrosphere, ocean, and we have ways that the hydrosphere interacts with the atmosphere. So it can exchange heat during evaporation or condensation. There's wind stress. The atmosphere is interacting with the hydrosphere because the winds can help form ocean currents. For example, surface ocean currents are formed by long-term wind patterns over the ocean. Rain falls into the ocean, water evaporates from the ocean. Atmosphere-ice interaction we have. For example, sea ice reflects almost all the incoming sunlight. And so on. By the way, the oceans are changing. The circulation patterns can change due to global warming. As we know, the polar regions are warming faster than other latitudes. And this is actually causing the North Atlantic Ocean current to possibly slow down over time because the temperature gradient between the equator and poles isn't as great. It's becoming less, and that slows down the net speed of transfer of energy from the equator in the northern hemisphere northward to the poles, and that could be causing the ocean current to slow down. Sea levels rising, we've talked about this. Okay, and the chemistry of the ocean is changing. Biogeochemistry kind of combines life, solid material, and chemistry all together. It's changing. Turns out the oceans can act as a large sink for carbon dioxide. We're very thankful for the oceans. If the oceans, specifically the surface ocean, wasn't able to absorb about nearly a quarter of all carbon dioxide released on Earth, atmospheric CO2 concentrations might already be 1,000 parts per million. Hydrosphere is not just made of the oceans, but also rivers and lakes. And then we have some changes in or on the land surface, such as orography. Mountains can form, and that affects albedo. Land use changes, deforestation, right? Vegetation, plants grow, and we grow crops. We have ecosystems here. Here are some components of the cryosphere. Sea ice, such as in the Arctic. Ice sheets. There's 3 major ones. Well, really 2 and then a smaller one. There's the Antarctic ice sheet, the largest ice sheet in the world. There's the Greenland ice sheet. There's also the Patagonia ice sheet. And then glaciers are faster moving than the sea ice and the ice sheets. So let's talk more about the cryosphere. It's, again, the component comprising all ice. That includes glaciers, which are basically masses of ice formed from snow falling and accumulating over several years and moving very slowly, either descending from high mountains, such as valley glaciers, sometimes called alpine glaciers, or moving outward from centers of accumulation, such as continental glaciers. There are ice sheets, which are broad, thick sheets of ice covering an extensive area for a very long period of time. Again, the 2 largest are Antarctica and Greenland ice sheets. There's also the Patagonia ice sheet in the southern tip of South America. And when the last ice age was going on, before 18,000 to 20,000 years ago, ice sheets extended into the continental United States of America. There is sea ice, and there are snow fields, other forms or components of the cryosphere. Sea ice is frozen seawater, basically, mainly in the Arctic Ocean, but it's also in the adjacent seas as far south as China and parts of China and Japan in the wintertime. And it also surrounds Antarctica. And there's a few different types of sea ice. There's pack ice, which is what most of the sea ice is. It's very mobile. It drifts across the ocean surface under the influence of wind and ocean currents and moves vertically under the influence of tides and waves. There's also land fast ice, sometimes just called fast ice, which is not mobile because it's either attached directly to the coast or seafloor, or it's locked in place between grounded icebergs. Finally, there's marine ice, which forms far below the ocean surface and at the bottom of ice shelves in Antarctica. Occasionally, it's seen in icebergs that calve from the ice shelves, and it may appear green because of organic material inside. Snow fields are large and generally permanent expanses of snow. So basically, accumulations of snow that don't melt, and so they stay there permanently, such as, on high mountains, the snow at the top of Mount Everest has been there for hundreds, thousands of years, right? It's not going anywhere, even with global warming. So, in terms of climate, the cryosphere is generally a high albedo surface. Remember how ice is very reflective. It reflects most of the incoming sunlight. And that definitely affects climate. Regions that are covered, say, in snow or ice generally remain cooler than otherwise because of the high albedo. Now, the cryosphere also has the positive feedback possibility, right? Remember the ice albedo feedback. So, given an initial warming or cooling, how the ice changes, ice coverage changes on the planet can affect temperature through the ice albedo feedback. And the cryosphere can store large amounts of water, which affects sea level. Okay, so for example, during the last ice age, sea level was perhaps hundreds of feet, in fact, hundreds of feet lower than now because of all that fresh water was locked away in the ice. But then what happened was when the last ice age ended, last glacial maximum ended about 18,000 years ago, all of that ice was now melted, it flowed into the oceans, and sea level rose a few hundred feet. And with global warming, melting of continental ice, especially on the edges of the ice sheets, such as Antarctica and Greenland, melting of glaciers is leading to an increase in sea level. Speaking of glaciers, they've been retreating in the last several decades. Here's a figure showing the same part of Glacier National Park, specifically showing the Shepherd Glacier in Glacier National Park in Montana. In 1913, over 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, in 2005, fairly recently. And you can see the striking difference. Okay, it's estimated that in 1850, there were approximately 150 glaciers present in this national park, before it was a national park. And by the way, to be considered a glacier, the mass of ice has to be at least 25 acres. And when the park opened in 1910, most of those glaciers, probably well over 100, were still present. But in 2010, there's only about 25 glaciers still remaining. So there's less glaciers than there used to be because they've been melting. Some of them have completely melted, basically, and some of them that were glaciers, some of the masses of ice that constitute glaciers now, have melted enough to where they're no longer considered glaciers. Here's just another picture illustrating the retreat or diminishment of glaciers. This is the McCarty Glacier in Alaska in 1909 on the bottom. Okay, very striking, very apparent. And then 2004, right? It's not there anymore. So, coming back to carbon. What is it? It's the fourth most abundant element in the universe. Okay? And it represents the building block of life. For example, it's in fossil fuels, which we know we are so dependent on to live, to make our electricity, to drive our cars, to manufacture our products. Okay. It's also, carbon is found in DNA in the double helix, which everyone has, right? Everyone has a different DNA. Now, carbon cycles through the land, which includes the biosphere, right? There's the plants, the trees, the animals, humans that live on the land or very near it. There's the ocean where carbon's cycling through, and it cycles through the atmosphere and the solid earth. And carbon is found in many places on Earth. It's found in all living things. Okay, there's carbon in all of us. When we breathe out, we breathe carbon out. It's found in the atmosphere in different forms, such as carbon dioxide. We'll be talking about other forms of it in the atmosphere. It's found in the layers of limestone sediment on the ocean floor, or ocean flow. Okay, and it's found in fossil fuels, such as coal. And the greatest source of electricity generation in the world is coal. So where is carbon? Okay. It exists in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and to a lesser extent methane, CH4. Current atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are above 400 parts per million. Methane concentrations have increased as well to near 2 parts per million. So there's about 200 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as methane. Not to say that methane isn't important when we talk about its contribution to the greenhouse effect. Recall that 1 molecule of methane has 25 times the warming potential of a molecule of carbon dioxide. In other words, 1 methane molecule has the warming effect as 25 carbon dioxide molecules. Thankfully, it exists in about 0.5% of abundancy in the atmosphere, and it only lasts about 12 years, a tenth of the time that carbon dioxide lasts on average. There is carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. We, of course, care about that in our homes because if carbon monoxide levels get high, and by the way, carbon monoxide is an invisible, odorless gas, then, you can have issues, right? Carbon is found in living biota, or plants and animals, such as solid carbon itself. Also glucose or sugar, which is a certain carbohydrate that the plants use for nourishment. It's found in soils and detritus, debris as carbon and methane. And it's found in the oceans as dissolved carbon dioxide. Most of the carbon, though, is found in the deep ocean. Now we'll talk about one component of the long-term carbon cycle being when the carbon that's absorbed by the surface ocean, it dissolves into the upper part of the ocean, sinks down into the deep ocean where it builds up, and then it can add to the limestone sediment on the ocean floor. Now, carbon is conserved. The initial carbon present during Earth's formation is the same as now. Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, and there's as much carbon as there was then as now. See, carbon doesn't increase or decrease globally, but carbon is exchanged between different components of the Earth system, or between the Earth systems, if you prefer. So you might be asking, well, how can this be? You've been saying that carbon dioxide concentrations have gone up to 400 parts per million, and they were never above 300 parts per million, going back 800,000 years before the early 1900s. Well, you have to remember that carbon exists in many forms, and carbon is being exchanged between the different Earth systems or spheres. So even though there's more carbon dioxide now than there has been going back nearly 1 million years before the early 20th century, that's not to say that the total amount of carbon in all the Earth systems has increased. What's happened is more of that carbon in the solid Earth, in fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas, has been burned, extracted from the solid Earth or geosphere, burned, released to the atmosphere. Just from fossil fuel burning alone, there's less carbon in the solid Earth now and more in the atmosphere, but that's not to say that the overall amount for the planet has changed. The carbon cycle refers to the complex series of reactions by which carbon passes through the Earth's atmosphere, land, including both biosphere and the solid Earth or crust, and the oceans. And you have to remember that carbon is exchanged throughout the Earth system at all time scales. So at all time scales. And we can talk about the long-term carbon cycle and the short-term carbon cycle. The long-term carbon cycle has a time scale of hundreds to millions of years. So when carbon is exchanged, transferred between different Earth spheres, and those exchanges are part of the long-term carbon cycle, it'll take centuries to millions of years in order for the carbon to be exchanged between the Earth systems. Whereas for the short-term carbon cycle, carbon is exchanged between the Earth systems on a timescale of seconds to a few years. Okay, seconds to a few years. So understand the different timescales of the long-term carbon cycle and short-term carbon cycle. Now, let's look at a figure showing different processes or elements of the global carbon cycle. This is figure 4.13 in the book. There is a lot of good information in this figure. First of all, focus your attention to the black and white category labels, text, and numbers. The text in black or white represents the name and size of major storage pools of carbon in gigatons, billions of metric tons, okay, of carbon. So the larger the number in black, the larger the size of carbon in that storage pool, okay, or in that location. And again, these numbers are in units of billion metric tons, and a billion metric ton is 10 to the 15th grams, okay? So for example, there's 750 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, and that includes the carbon in carbon dioxide, in methane, and carbon monoxide. Alright. Now the red numbers show the size of annual yearly carbon fluxes in gigatons of carbon equivalents per year. Basically the gigatons of carbon exchanged per year. Alright. So, I have a question. What is the largest storage pool of carbon? In other words, where on Earth would you find the most carbon? And what really stands out is sedimentary rocks. There's 66 million gigatons of carbon in the sedimentary rocks. And one form of sedimentary rock is limestone. The next closest storage pool in size of carbon is deep ocean with 38,100 gigatons of carbon. If you do the math, you'd see that there's 732 times as much carbon in sedimentary rocks as the deep ocean. So the overwhelming majority of carbon for Earth or on Earth is inside of sedimentary rocks underground in the Earth's crust. You see that the atmosphere, compared to the deep ocean and sedimentary ocean, has a relatively small amount of carbon with 750 gigatons. But that's not to say by any means that we don't care about the carbon dioxide and methane concentrations that are increasing in the atmosphere. And you see some of the other numbers. You see there's a little more carbon in the surface ocean than the atmosphere. You see there's slightly less carbon in vegetation compared to the atmosphere on average. These numbers are basically global annual averages for the whole world, right? Some forms of vegetation have more carbon, some have less, and also the amount of carbon in vegetation depends on the seasons. Now let's start looking at red, the exchanges of carbon between the different storage pools. Again, the red number tells you the gigatons of carbon exchanged per year. So think about it. If the number is larger, that means there's more gigatons of carbon exchanged from one storage pool to another per year. If the number is smaller, there's less gigatons of carbon exchanged from one storage pool to another in a year. So hence, larger numbers indicate faster processes because there's greater rates of exchange of carbon per year, so they're faster processes. They're parts of the short-term carbon cycle. Whereas the smaller numbers represent less carbon exchanged between the storage pools each year, slower rates of exchange, hence long-term carbon cycle. Again, you can see how in this figure, carbon is, like we've been saying, an exchange between the different Earth spheres or systems. Okay, so let's start looking at some of them. For example, carbon is exchanged between the atmosphere and the surface ocean, part of the hydrosphere. Carbon is exchanged between the biosphere and the atmosphere. Carbon is exchanged between the geosphere and the atmosphere. Okay. What looks to be the slowest rate of exchange of carbon on this figure? It's this one. Only 0.3 gigatons of carbon is transferred from sedimentary rocks to the atmosphere each year. So recognize that there's such a giant storage pool of carbon inside the solid Earth, and yet very little of that carbon inside the sedimentary rocks actually enters the atmosphere each year. Okay? What about the fastest rate of exchange, the greatest rate of exchange of carbon per year between any storage pools? It's this one. 121 gigatons of carbon is transferred between the atmosphere and vegetation, such as trees shown here, plants. Each year, that's part of photosynthesis. Okay, part of photosynthesis. And you'll see that it takes a long time for carbon in the deep ocean to build up as sediments at the ocean floor. Now, again, the carbon cycle has different speeds. There's a short-term carbon cycle and a long-term carbon cycle. And we were looking at some examples of these two on the previous slide. Let's start talking more about the short-term carbon cycle in particular to help us understand the reason for those oscillations or wobbles in the Keeling curve. So, one example of the short-term carbon cycle involves plants. Photosynthesis is the conversion of carbon dioxide in water into a sugar called glucose, which is a carbohydrate using sunlight energy. Oxygen is produced as a waste product, and plants use this carbohydrate as a form of nourishment to grow. So what happens is carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, along with water, combines. Those two chemicals combine using sunlight energy. Okay, and then when the carbon dioxide and water, the reactants combine, they form two products. Okay, this is a chemical reaction. One is carbohydrate or glucose, and that is used for the plant's nourishment. Okay, that's what the plants use as kind of their food, and it's used to help them grow. Okay, and then oxygen is produced, but that's just released back to the atmosphere as a waste product. The plants don't really use that oxygen, but they do use the carbohydrate as a form of nourishment to grow. This is photosynthesis. Okay, respiration is basically the reverse chemical reaction, where instead oxygen and the carbohydrate combine, and they produce carbon dioxide and water, and the carbon dioxide is then released back to the atmosphere. When plants decay, carbon returns to the atmosphere. So, if you think about the growing season, you can understand that during spring and summertime when the plants are growing, it's getting warmer, the days are getting longer, okay, more sunlight hours, warmer temperatures. Plants growing, there's more photosynthesis as they grow, and they, of course, need the photosynthesis in order to grow. But during the fall and the winter time, the days become shorter, the temperatures become colder, the plants start decaying and dying, so then that carbon inside of them is released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and there's more respiration than photosynthesis in fall and winter, whereas there's more photosynthesis than respiration in spring and summer. So, here's a figure, another Keeling curve figure. Okay, it's it doesn't get old, right? You can just keep looking at it, and It's so powerful. It's such an important fundamental figure when we study global warming. Okay. And so now we have in red are basically monthly carbon dioxide measurements going from 1958 to just recently. Okay, close to now. 2016, March 2016 is when this figure was released. And we want to understand the wobbles. So, what we can do is let's zoom in on just the past few years of carbon dioxide in order to be able to see the wobbles better and see when carbon dioxide increases and when it decreases, okay? What months of the year are carbon dioxide concentrations at Mauna Loa highest? What months of the year are they lowest? Let's understand the annual cycle or seasonal cycle more. Alright. Now we're just looking at carbon dioxide concentrations at Mauna Loa from January 2012 to March 2016, just a few months ago. And in red we have the monthly values. Black is basically the running average. It's a way of smoothing out the data. It takes several months prior to a specific month and several months after, and it uses that to help come up with a average. It's just a way of smoothing out the monthly variations. We're not so concerned with that. We want to focus on the monthly variations to help understand them better. So, let's figure out in what month carbon dioxide concentrations are highest, okay? So, here are some questions we want to answer. In one calendar year, in what months are atmospheric CO2 concentrations highest and lowest? Okay. In what month are atmospheric CO2 concentrations highest and lowest? And what factors contribute to the annual cycle in carbon dioxide concentrations? In other words, why do the carbon dioxide levels go up and down over the course of a year? All right. So we need to come back to the graph to help answer those questions. Let's figure it out. So here's 2012, right? Good year for Giants, right? The second of 3 World Series championships in a span of 4 years. Okay. 4 calendar years, 2010, 2014, but 5 seasons, right? Second in a span of 3 championships in 5 seasons. Okay. So here's 2012. January 2012. CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa was just over 393 parts per million. And then it went up to near 394 parts per million in February. And it kept going up into March, April, and May. So it peaked in May at about 397 parts per million. Keep that in mind, May. And then it started going down. June, July, August, September, October. Okay, October 2012, it was down when the Giants were in the playoffs that year, okay, playing teams like the Reds, the Cardinals, and then the Tigers in the World Series. It was just over 391 parts per million, maybe slightly under even. Then it started going up again. November, December, January 2013, February, March, April, May. So it reaches in both 2012 and 2013, it reached a peak in May. And then it started decreasing. June, July, August, September, October. So in 2013, it was at a minimum in September. Okay. Whereas 2012, it was reached a yearly minimum in October. Let's continue. See what happens. October, November, December. January 2014, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. October, November, December, January 2015, February, March, April, May 2015, June, July, August, September. Do you see the trend? Okay, can we answer the question, in what months are atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations highest and lowest? Okay. So, are carbon dioxide levels highest in January, May, July, or September/October? And if you've been paying attention, following along, you'll be able to answer it. The answer is May. Second question here. Carbon dioxide levels are lowest in this month, specifically the question, that's more of a statement. The question would be, in what month are carbon dioxide levels or concentrations lowest over the course of a year? January, May, July, or September/October? And the answer, again, if you've been paying along, again, you'll be able to, following along, you'll be able to understand. September or October. We saw that for 2012, it was in October, but for 2013, 14, and 15, it was in September. So it turns out usually when we go back almost 50 years, we'd see that generally carbon dioxide concentrations reach a minimum in September, but some years it is actually October, as was the case in 2012. So we would like to be able to answer now why carbon dioxide levels go up and down over the course of a year. So think about that. They reach over the course of a year, the highest in May and their lowest in September, October. So that means they're going down after May, from May through September or October, and they're going up from September or October, generally, let's say September, to May. So they decrease from the late spring into the summer, into the early fall, and then they increase from fall through spring. Okay? And can we understand why? Well, think about it. Plants begin growing at greater rates, and there's more plants growing in when? Spring. So in spring, the photosynthesis starts exceeding respiration, so the plants take in more CO2 than they release, so that causes atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations to go down starting in after May, right? And then in the fall and the winter time, the plants respiration from plants exceeds photosynthesis. They start decaying and dying. So that's why. So then there's more carbon dioxide being released than taken in. So that's why carbon dioxide levels start going up in the fall and winter time. Until we reach the spring. So we can add on. This is to a previous slide we had, and we can add on under during spring and summer. There's more photosynthesis. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels go down. Okay, during the spring and the summertime. During fall and winter time, more respiration. The atmospheric carbon dioxide levels go up. Now, plants aren't the only example of the short-term carbon cycle. Other examples of the short-term carbon cycle include soils and detritus. Organic matter can decay and release carbon on very fast scales. And the surface oceans also absorb carbon dioxide via photosynthesis. There's certain plant material in the upper parts of the ocean, such as phytoplankton, that take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and they release carbon dioxide as well through respiration. So recognize that photosynthesis and respiration are not only relevant for the land and vegetation or biosphere parts of the land, but also the ocean. And here's a figure showing some short-term carbon exchanges. Okay, so these are some different examples of the short-term carbon cycle, right? Here's trees taking in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen during photosynthesis. Tree dies, okay, turned down or turned sideways, decomposes, release carbon back to the atmosphere. And then the carbon, it releases the atmosphere, combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. Again, phytoplankton can take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. There's a region of the ocean, the upper part where the water is shallow enough where light can penetrate. You know how you go deeper in the ocean, it gets darker, right? Fish swim in the oceans. We know that. Carbon can then make its way from the upper ocean to the bottom of the ocean, and the ocean floor sediments can get covered up and become sedimentary rocks. And then over time move from below the ocean to below land. Cows, sheep, goats can release methane, okay, CH4 or CH4 if you prefer, for the low. Agriculture uses carbon dioxide and produces oxygen, but also is a source of methane. Fossil fuels are emitted from burning of diesel for trucks, gasoline in cars, jet fuel in planes, oil, products made from oil. They're also burned from manufacturing, from oil burned to manufacture goods and products. Fossil fuels are also burned from coal power plants and natural gas power plants to make power. So hopefully you're getting a good understanding of the way carbon can exchange between the different spheres or systems of the Earth on short terms. Okay, on short-term cycles. Now let's talk about the long-term carbon cycle. Carbon is slowly and continuously being transported between the Earth systems. And to review, the Earth systems include the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, which is mainly made up of the oceans, the biosphere, the Earth's crust, which is part of the geosphere, and rocks like limestone. We're not listing cryosphere on here, but it's relevant too. Perhaps not as much so when we talk about carbon being transported between the Earth systems as the other four. The main components to the long-term carbon cycle are four. There's four major components of the long-term carbon cycle, and we will be discussing them in detail. 1, chemical weathering, also called the silicate to carbonate conversion process. It's called this because during this chemical weathering, silicate rocks, such as granite, are transformed into carbonate rocks, such as limestone. And this is part of the long-term carbon cycle. So you have to remember, this takes hundreds to millions of years, okay? Photosynthesis, respiration take a few seconds to a few years or so, right? Makes sense, photosynthesis and respiration cause carbon dioxide levels to go up and down over the course of months. That's clearly part of the short-term carbon cycle. Long-term carbon cycle is much slower. Subduction and volcanism is the second component of the long-term carbon cycle. You might know of volcanism. You might not know much about subduction. It's fine. We'll be going into more detail about what it is. The third main component of the long-term carbon cycle is organic carbon burial. And finally, the fourth component of the long-term carbon cycle is oxidation of organic carbon. And oxidation is just a fancy word for basically combining with oxygen. So, let's start our discussion in detail of these four components of the long-term carbon cycle by looking at a figure or a diagram. And this diagram is a lot of information. It might not make a whole lot of sense to you yet, but if it does, great. If it doesn't, it's fine. It'll make more sense as we go through the components in detail. So, we have carbonates underground, you see here, below the atmosphere, the ocean, and the biosphere. Carbonates are basically molecules or substances made up of carbon and oxygen. And through subduction and volcanism, they can be released into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide. And what is put in the atmosphere can then be taken in by the oceans, dissolve as carbon dioxide in the upper parts, and also be taken in by the biosphere. And material from the atmosphere and the oceans and the biosphere can return underground or into carbonate rock, like limestone, through the silicate to carbonate conversion process. Now there's also buried organic carbon, which is just carbon by itself, not combined with oxygen underground. And it can be buried underground. That's how it gets there, okay? But it can also be put back into the atmosphere through oxidation of buried organic carbon, okay? So, question for you. What is the silicate to carbonate conversion process? It's one component of the long-term carbon cycle. What is it? Let's discuss it to find out. Here's granite, a silicate rock, okay? Here you are, that's you. You're checking out some of these rocks or these boulders, large rocks, right? Nice boulders, okay? And you're not in this picture, maybe you're taking the picture. Here's limestone, which is a carbonate rock. So through the silicate to carbonate conversion process, over centuries to millions of years, you can go from this type of rock, granite, to this type of rock, limestone. And how does that happen? Okay, so there's 3 phases of the silicate to carbonate conversion process, which is the first component, main component of the long-term carbon cycle. Okay, let's discuss them. Number 1, the chemical weathering phase. So remember how we kind of said chemical weathering or the silicate to carbonate conversion process as the first major component of the long-term carbon cycle? Well, really, in reality, chemical weathering is just one part or one phase of the silicate to carbonate conversion process. So perhaps it's better to call that first component of the long-term carbon cycle the silicate to carbonate conversion process, because chemical weathering is part of it, but only one phase. So what is chemical weathering? Okay, it's not weather itself. Okay, weathering is different from weather. Okay, weather is the state of the atmosphere at a particular time or place. It includes variables such as wind, humidity, temperature, precipitation, cloud coverage. Chemical weathering is this: carbon dioxide from the atmosphere combines with rainwater to produce carbonic acid. Okay, carbonic acid, H2CO3. Okay, so CO2 combines with H2O to produce carbonic acid, H2CO3. Now, what do you know about acids? Okay, there's a reason when you've taken a chemistry lab in high school or college, you have to make sure to wear, the proper clothing. You don't want to wear really nice clothes because they can, get destroyed. They can get stained by the chemicals. But you also want to make sure you protect your hands, your face, right? There's a reason you wear glasses, you wear gloves. What happens if the acid gets on your skin, right? It can burn, okay? It can erode it away if it's strong enough, okay? So carbonic acid can dissolve silicate rock. It can weather it away, okay? So you have a silicate rock like granite, and then what happens? It rains, and the carbon dioxide combines with the rain, and that forms a carbonic acid, which dissolves the silicate rock away. That's the chemical weathering phase. Okay, second phase of the silicate to carbonate conversion process is transport. So what happens is that solution that's formed as the carbonic acid dissolves the silicate rock is then transported to the ocean by rivers, right? So rivers basically flow into the ocean, okay? So the carbonic acid gets eroded away, weathered away, and combines with the silicate rock. And that solution is taken into the ocean by rivers. It flows in the rivers into the ocean. And then, when it reaches the oceans, the formation phase happens. What that means is that in the oceans, the calcium carbonate, CO3, precipitates out of the solution and settles to the bottom. So you have this carbonic acid along with silicate rock, this solution composed of both carbonic acid and silicate rock, combining with ocean salt water, which is made up of H2O along with salt, right? Such as one form of salt is sodium chloride, right? And if you've ever done a chemistry lab, you might also see sometimes you can mix a couple solutions, and what happens? A solid precipitates or forms out, okay? So that's kind of what's happening here. Now we can look at this on a diagram, because that might help you understand it better. Look at this beautiful, fancy diagram, right? We have rain. We have, what are these waves, okay? Land here. So what happens is CO2 or carbon dioxide dissolves in the rainwater. And that is part of the chemical weathering phase. The next part of the chemical weathering phase is that carbonic acid forms, it dissolves the silicates, okay? So these two steps are both make up the chemical weathering phase. The second phase of the silicate to carbonate conversion process is the transport phase. So this dissolved material is then transported to the oceans by rivers. And then number 4 here represents the third phase of the silicate to carbonate conversion process, the precipitation phase, or the formation phase. Calcium carbonate, CaCO3, I think I said Ca2, correction, it's CaCO3, forms in the ocean, shown by these beautiful filled in circles, and settles to the bottom. And that forms calcium carbonate. So we went from a silicate rock to a carbonate rock. And as simple as it looks on this figure, this takes hundreds to millions of years. Now, chemical weathering may be changing, or in fact, there's evidence that it is changing because of global warming. Let's talk about it. And by the way, we're going to be talking about a feedback, and this would be a great example to include if you haven't done your activity 6 yet, or if you're still working on that. So, chemical weathering is temperature dependent. The rate of chemical weathering is temperature dependent. Why? Well, the rate of evaporation of water is temperature dependent. Okay? So, as temperatures increase, what happens to the amount of evaporation? Remember the water vapor feedback? Warmer temperature means more evaporation off the oceans. Okay? And what does that do to the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere? It goes up. What does that do to the number of clouds in the atmosphere? If there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, you can have more clouds. Remember the cloud feedback. And if you have more clouds, you could expect more rain. So increasing temperature increases chemical weathering because you have more evaporation, more water vapor in the atmosphere, more clouds, and more rain. And with more rain, you have more water, what you need to combine with the carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid to start chemical weathering. Now, here is how we can understand that in terms of a feedback. As atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations increase, the planet warms. Okay? We know that. Concentrations of CO2 are going up, strengthening the greenhouse effect, leading to a warmer surface temperature. This will increase the rate of evaporation, hence increase the flow of carbon into the rock cycle. Now, what you have to remember is that chemical weathering removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? How does chemical weathering affect the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? It lowers it. Because during chemical weathering, that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere combines with water, rain, to produce carbonic acid, which then erodes the silicate rock and the solution is transported to the ocean. So that's more chemical weathering would lead to more carbon dioxide being removed from the atmosphere. Okay? And then if we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that alone has a cooling effect because that weakens the greenhouse effect and lowers the planet's temperature. Question: does this bullet point here, these statements, does this represent a positive or negative feedback? It is a negative feedback because remember the initial change was a warming of Earth, and through these series of steps, now we have a cooling which counteracts the initial change, right? Reduces the effects of the initial change or the initial change, okay? So it's a negative feedback. Helps bring the climate system back to equilibrium. Now, when we talk about carbon, we can talk about Earth and Venus. And it turns out that the amount of carbon in carbonate minerals on Earth, such as in limestone, a sedimentary rock, is about the same as the amount of carbon in Venus's atmosphere. Okay, remember how Venus has an atmosphere that's more than 100 times as massive as Earth's, and 96% of Venus's atmosphere is carbon dioxide. Okay, Venus is known for its incredible greenhouse effect and hence incredible surface temperatures on average of 896 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, when you know how there's a tremendous amount of carbon in the sedimentary rocks, okay, 66 million gigatons of carbon in sedimentary rocks, well, the amount of carbon in the carbonate minerals, such as sedimentary rocks, is about the same as the amount in Venus's atmosphere. So on Earth, the large majority of carbon dioxide that's been produced is now locked up in the carbonates. It's locked up in the sedimentary rocks. Okay, in fact, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations have reached spectacular values in the past. Over around 440 million years ago, CO2 concentrations possibly topped 5,000 parts per million. Okay. Now remember, humans have only existed on Earth for about 200 to 250,000 years, a fifth to a quarter of a million years in our current form. Okay, so this was long ago before humans, right? Perhaps before some of the many dinosaurs, right? On Venus, though, the silicate to carbonate conversion process apparently never took place. Okay. So there used to be a lot more carbon in Earth's atmosphere, but what happened is, through the silicate to carbonate conversion process, it became locked up, removed from the atmosphere, and put into the carbonate rocks. Okay, this hasn't really taken place though on Venus, which is why most of its carbon is still in the atmosphere. Okay, hopefully that's helps you understand the silicate to the chemical weathering phase, the chemical weathering component of the long-term carbon cycle. What was second on our list of the four components of the long-term carbon cycle? Subduction and volcanism. So this is another component of the long-term carbon cycle. Well, what is subduction? They go hand in hand. Subduction and volcanism go hand in hand. That's why they're kind of combined as one component of the long-term carbon cycle. But what is subduction in particular? It's basically the process of the ocean plate descending beneath the continental plate. Okay, ocean plate is thinner but denser than the continental plate. So when it combines, when an oceanic plate and a continental plate come together, the oceanic plate slides or descends underneath the continental plate because it's denser. And when this happens, an extreme amount of heat and pressure convert carbonate rocks eventually into carbon dioxide. So when this happens, there's a tremendous amount of heat and pressure generated, and that generates the heat generates magma underground, which can then ascend up into the crust, higher into the solid earth, and eventually that magma can move up in a volcano, and when the volcano erupts, the magma is then termed lava. And when the volcano erupts, carbon in the solid earth, carbonate rocks, can then turn into carbon dioxide, because remember, volcanoes release carbon dioxide. So it's actually common to see volcanoes downwind or downwards of a subduction zone. By the way, subduction zones can generate large earthquakes. The San Andreas Fault in California is a transverse plate boundary. It's not a subduction zone. Two plates are sliding past one another. You don't have an oceanic plate diving under a continental plate. But subduction zone zones can generate large earthquakes. Example, Pacific Northwest has a subduction zone near Seattle, and that subduction zone up there can generate earthquakes every few hundred years, maybe 500 years. Actually, every 500 years or so, a magnitude 8 to 9 Richter scale earthquake can be generated. Okay, and the subduction zones are better able to generate tsunamis than, say, transverse faults. Okay. When a volcano erupts, it can emit carbon dioxide. So volcanic eruptions can inject large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Here's another picture of Mount Pinatubo erupting before most of you were born in June of 1991. And when Pinatubo erupted, it injected a lot of different chemicals into the atmosphere. It injected 17 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. By the way, sulfur dioxide is very interesting because it's a gas, but when it's released into the atmosphere by a volcano, it tends to form sulfate aerosols. We'll be talking about aerosols more in the next lecture, lecture 8, the types of them. But sulfate aerosols are one form of an aerosol. And sulfur dioxide usually leads to an increase in the formation of sulfate aerosols. Sulfur dioxide, initially a gas, transfers into sulfate aerosols. And so sulfur dioxide actually tends to have a cooling effect on Earth because it forms these aerosols that reflect sunlight. Megaton is a million tons. Okay, a ton's 2,000 pounds, right? So a million times 2,000 pounds would be what? 2 billion pounds, okay? There's a lot of material. There's a lot of material released during a volcanic eruption. Pinatubo erupted and emitted 42 megatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay. So yes, that's a lot. We care about that. But like we were talking about in lecture 5 on natural forcing factors, even though volcanoes can emit large amounts of carbon dioxide, they tend to cool the planet because the cooling outweighs the warming, okay? The amount of carbon dioxide released during volcanic eruptions tend to be very small compared to the amount of fossil fuel burning, so their release of dust, salt, aerosols tends to outweigh the contribution to the greenhouse effect by them. The eruption released a few megatons of chlorine and also a lot of water. And this water was important because this water was released and it helped form clouds of smoke. Okay. Now let's talk about the last two components of the long-term carbon cycle. Organic carbon burial and oxidation of buried carbon. So, how does organic carbon burial work? Well, living plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the process of photosynthesis, right? And when dead plants decay, the carbon dioxide is put back into the atmosphere, okay, through respiration. And this happens fairly quickly. This is part of the short-term carbon cycle, right? It happens fairly quickly when the carbon in the plants is oxidized, which means that the carbon in the plants combines with oxygen in the atmosphere to produce carbon dioxide. Okay, the plants during respiration do not directly release carbon dioxide from themselves. They release carbon, and then the carbon combines with the oxygen in the atmosphere to produce carbon dioxide. Okay. But some carbon in the plants escapes oxidation when it's covered up by sediments. So not all of the carbon in the plants is immediately oxidized and put in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Okay? Some of it gets covered up, it gets hidden from the atmosphere. And we can see that on a diagram on the next slide. Okay, and again, when we talk about vegetation and photosynthesis and respiration, we're talking about plants, we're also talking about trees. So, here's a tree, and there's carbon in the tree, and carbon dioxide gets removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, and oxygen is released as a waste product. Okay, now the plant decays, it's on its side, or the tree decays and dies, and there's carbon inside of it that's put back into the atmosphere as it decays through respiration. But some carbon escapes oxidation, some carbon gets covered up by sediments, by debris, by dust, and so if the carbon is not exposed to the atmosphere, it's not going to be able to combine with oxygen, and no CO2 is going to go in the atmosphere. And so if it's covered up and it escapes oxidation, what then can happen over a long period of time is the carbon gets buried deeper underground. And this puts carbon into the land. Okay? Then when the fourth last component of the long-term carbon cycle comes in is when the buried organic carbon gets oxidized. So eventually, over long periods of time, hundreds to millions of years, that organic carbon can be exposed by erosion. Okay, so over long periods of time, eventually enough erosion can happen where that carbon, which was covered up and hidden from the atmosphere and buried underground, then gets re-exposed to the atmosphere, and then it can be oxidized to carbon dioxide. And then carbon can be transferred from the solid Earth back into the atmosphere. So here's an example. Here's the atmosphere shown above this almost horizontal line, and here's buried carbon. It could be coal. By the way, the fossil fuels are three fossil fuels are hydrocarbons. Okay, there's coal, there's oil, there's natural gas. So we have this cluster, large amount of coal here, and erosion happens, and eventually that coal can be exposed to the atmosphere, and then the part of the coal that's exposed can be oxidized, and the carbon then goes into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Okay, fossil fuels are formed over millions of years as dead organic material, plants, animals decay, and that decayed material is exposed to tremendous amounts of heat and pressure over long periods of time, and that converts the decayed organic material into fossil fuels that we can use to generate energy. Okay, so oxygen combines with carbon and produces carbon dioxide. Okay. Alrighty. So, there's a couple components of the long-term carbon cycle. There's the first two components, there's four major components. But the first two components are inorganic components. The silicate to carbonate conversion process and subduction/volcanism are considered inorganic components because they don't require life in order to happen. But the last two, organic carbon burial and from trees and plants, and oxidation of buried organic carbon, are considered organic components because they do need life basically in order to happen completely. So there you go. And we can come back to our fancy diagram and understand that through subduction, volcanism, carbon is transferred from carbonates underground into the atmosphere and to the ocean and to the biosphere, whereas material can be transferred from the atmosphere, oceans, or biosphere to the carbonates via the silicate to carbonate conversion process. And carbon in the atmosphere, ocean, or biosphere can be buried underground through organic carbon burial, and then over hundreds of millions of years, the buried organic carbon can be oxidized and put back into the atmosphere, where it can then dissolve into the ocean or be taken in by the biosphere. And here's just another figure for you. showing fast and slow processes in the carbon cycle. This figure is nice because it combines both the short-term and long-term carbon cycle. So where you have, basically, you're looking at different color arrows. And when you have the red arrow very fast or the orange arrow fast, that's generally short-term carbon cycle, because the red arrows are showing processes that take less than a year. Okay, and the orange, or kind of orange-yellow arrows are showing processes that take 1 to 10 years, or about a few years. So this is short-term carbon cycle, seconds to a few years. The green, though, light green, shows 10 to 100 years, so decade to a century. And then when you get into the, so that's kind of on the border of in between short-term and long-term carbon cycle. And then when you get into dark green, very slow, more than 100 years, more than a century, that's when you're talking about the long-term carbon cycle. So we can see how carbon exchange between the atmosphere and vegetation, photosynthesis, respiration, part of the short-term carbon cycle. When carbon dioxide gets released during forest fires, that's part of the short-term carbon cycle. Fossil fuel burning releases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's part of the short-term carbon cycle. And when carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the phytoplankton in the upper parts of the ocean or the surface water, or released back into the atmosphere by this phytoplankton, that's also generally part of the short-term carbon cycle. But then we can start to look at the long-term carbon cycle here on this diagram. It takes more than 100 years, it can take hundreds of years for that carbon dioxide in the upper part of the ocean to sink down. And sink down as it does so, remember how the carbonate, calcium carbonate, precipitates out and forms layers of sediment on the bottom floor, and that can form new sediment and exchange the carbon originally from the atmosphere through the hydrosphere into the geosphere. But again, it could take hundreds of years, folks, for the carbon in one form, carbon dioxide in the upper ocean, to reach the bottom of the ocean and add new layers of limestone sediment to the ocean floor. Finally, coming back to another figure showing fast and slow processes of the carbon cycle, figure 4.13 in your book. Greatly encourage you to review this figure. So, that's the lecture for the carbon cycle, and we will have a few discussion questions related to this lecture.